Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Denali National Park in central Alaska once again. The park's highway travels from Anchorage in the south to Fairbanks in the north. As the highway skirts Denali, the Denali Park Road heads west and takes travelers for about 50 miles through the park's heart. This road twists and turns along rivers and climbs to ridgetops featuring unsurpassed views of pristine territory. Given this road grants visitors such unparalleled access, it also brings hikers and photographers and all sorts of nature lovers. The lush green forests of poplar, birch, larch, and aspen trees accommodate stands of fir and spruce trees, leaving the banks of streams and rivers to willow and alder stands. With hiking trails breaking off from the road periodically, trekkers are free to access remote regions of the park to view moose, caribou, and sheep that wander the hillsides. As they climb and side-hill the trails, hikers are frequently not expecting to run into any of the predators of this area, which include bobcats, black bears, coyotes, lynx, wolves, and brown bears. Even in this peaceful and beautiful area, a close encounter of the clawed kind may leave a person in extreme peril. On July 21, 1972, 22-year-old Chris Cobble was enjoying a lonesome hike along the Toklat River about 1.5 miles south of the Denali Park Highway, just east of Divide Mountain. The gravel bars were easier to walk than some trails this time of year, as the plants grow quickly with the additional hours of daylight. Crowding the trail sides and blocking visibility for hikers means that the plants can be a real impediment to safety. As Chris navigated the gravel bar, he glanced ahead of him to make sure he didn't surprise any grizzly bears that may be feeding on salmon or berries along the river. About 3/4 of a mile ahead of him, he saw the shape of a massive grizzly bear stand out from the green plants surrounding it. It was located near the bottom of one of the hillsides, and Chris determined he would find a wide route around the bear to avoid any confrontation with it. After looking over the lay of the land, he decided on a route and headed in that direction. As he climbed, making sure to stay a few hundred yards away from the bear, he kept in mind the bear's approximate location with his. He'd hoped that he could find a spot uphill from the bears and watch it for a while, just to see what it was up to. As curiosity frequently does, it got the best of Chris. He'd hiked the route he'd planned on in hopes of avoiding the bear, but had the bear stayed where it was when Chris had started? What if the bear had unexpectedly decided to head up the hill in Chris's direction, and he didn't know it? Being so close to such a dangerous predator can play tricks on your mind, and all Chris needed was to rid himself of such anxious thoughts. Chris climbed a small knob and hoped that it would lend him a view of the bear's previous location. He took off his backpack and laid it at the bottom of the rise before stepping his way toward the point. His curiosity got the best of him as he leaned out over the knob and peered through the brush below him. As he searched the area below him, he suddenly saw a brown blur out of one of the corners of his eye. Chris craned his head toward the blur and noticed 2 half-grown grizzly cubs to his right, about 100 yards away from him. They were slowly making their way toward him. It occurred to him that if there were 2 cubs, then there must be at least one sow very near them. That is when his stomach tied itself into knots, and he had a sense of impending doom overwhelm him. Just as Chris had stepped back from the edge of the knoll, a huge sow grizzly bear stepped into view, only about 120 yards from him. She was down the hill from the cubs a short distance and seemed very concerned about how far from her they'd traveled. Chris tried to slink away before catching her eye, but grizzlies who don't pay attention don't survive. Chris was filled with terror as he watched the sow's head snap in his direction. Her intense gaze let him know that she was aware of his presence, and her actions let him know she was not happy about it. After only a few seconds of staring at him, the sow planted her back feet in the soil and took the first of only a few bounds toward him. Chris immediately began backing up and yelling at the sow. His only hope was that she was bluffing and only trying to frighten him away from her cubs. He quickly made his way down the slope a few yards, trying to escape from her line of sight. The sow covered the 120 yards between them in what may have only been 4 or 5 seconds. As soon as she got near Chris, she began swatting him with her massive paws and raking him with her claws. Near a large willow bush, the sow pushed Chris onto his back. Her claws had already torn gashes into his right leg, and her teeth tore a few more holes into it to boot.
Chris immediately knew his best bet was to roll onto his stomach and remain still. He flipped over and covered his head and face with his arms, in hopes of limiting the damage done to them. Now face down, Chris could feel the angry sow slashing at his back and arms. She was biting anything that she could reach with her jaws and clawing anything else. Just as he felt her teeth tearing his scalp on the back of his head, the sow disappeared. Although her angry attack was a mere 5 seconds in length, it had done more damage to Chris's body than most car accidents. He could feel his blood seeping from wounds all over his body and the warmth of it as it ran down his cheeks. Chris was too afraid to look and see where the sow was. He lay there, frozen, and waiting for a follow-up attack, but it never came. The forest was silent, and the river churned below him. After several seconds, Chris peeked through his fingers at the surrounding brush. The worst-case scenario would be that he would see her sitting and staring at him from a few yards away, but she was nowhere to be found. Chris listened for any sign that the bears were nearby, but was met with silence. Over the next few minutes, Chris began to gain confidence that the sow had left him. He slowly rose to his knees and searched cautiously, just to make sure of his hopes. Once he was confident she was not near him, he slowly climbed to his feet. Chris's first thoughts must have been how to get out of there and back to safety and civilization as quickly as possible, but he still wasn't certain of the direction in which the bears had left. If they'd fled toward the Denali Park Road, then he might run right back into them. He soon realized that it was a chance he would have to take. Chris began to assess a few of his wounds that were easily examined. They were bad and painful, but they were not serious enough to prevent him from hiking out. Slowly and cautiously, he picked his way back through the brush and along the gravel bar toward the road. He would have about 1.5 miles of a hike to get to the safety of the road, and completed it in record time, while glancing over his shoulder the entire way. Once safely out, Chris was able to flag down other park visitors. He was transported to the hospital, where his wounds were cleaned and sutured closed. All told, the sow had left him with gashes on his right leg, along his arms, and across his back. Her teeth had punched large holes in his right leg and along parts of his back. She had also bitten the back of his head, though she did not crush his skull. Chris had battled a grizzly sow, and was left with the scars to prove it. As far as the sow and cubs go, there is no record of the rangers doing anything to kill or capture them. The sow's attack on Chris was viewed as a defensive attack, given that she was defending her cubs from a perceived threat. She'd left without burying Chris, and did not stick around to defend him as her food. After reviewing the harrowing details of this attack, I am left with a few questions for you. Would you consider hiking in Denali after hearing the details of Chris's attack? Do you think the cubs witnessed anything that they may repeat in their own lives? How much more damage could the sow have done to Chris in the few seconds she had him at her mercy? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Grand Prairie, Alberta, Canada. This area is covered with broad oat fields, ringed by enormous rolling forests of quaking aspen, European mountain ash, poplar, and elder trees. Beneath this emerald canopy, bushes like serviceberry, raspberry, chokecherry, and dogwood display their beautiful flowers and offer sugary treats to birds and animals alike. Along the ground, stunning arrays of wild sunflowers and ox-eye daisies dance in the prairie breezes. The elevation of this land undulates in the lower 2,000-foot range, and seasons are dramatic, with hot, dry summers and cold, snowy winters. Game animals here are plentiful and diverse. Moose, elk, pronghorned antelope, bison, as well as white-tailed deer and mule deer meander along the edges of fields. The predators in this area include bobcats, coyotes, and wolves. With this abundance of game and berry options for food, black bears and brown bears are thriving. On August 12, 2007, 32-year-old Chris McClellan relocated to Grand Prairie from Prospero, Nova Scotia with his wife and son. The newlywed landed a job as a welder and was an avid outdoorsman. One of his favorite activities was bow hunting, and Grand Prairie was a great spot to do it. On August 15, 2007, Chris decided to go out scouting for archery season by himself. He decked himself out in full-body camouflage, including a face mask, so that animals might not see him as he scouted. McClellan drove onto Range Road 73 to a farmer's oat field, about 12 kilometers south of the small town of Grovedale, blissfully unaware of just how much excitement and danger this day had in store for him. The archery hunter spent a few hours glassing the fence rows and assessing his odds of success. He began to work his way back toward his vehicle about 9:30 p.m. Chris hadn't packed bear spray, nor was he carrying a firearm on his trip. His only form of self-defense was a hunting knife, with a 12-inch long blade and a digital camera. Just before dusk, Chris was walking through a field that had a small knoll in the middle. He was approaching the knoll when he noticed a huge grizzly bear standing to her feet, only 60 yards away from him. Somehow the knoll had been just high enough to screen the bear from Chris's view and him from hers. Chris's knees immediately began to knock as fear overwhelmed him as soon as he saw the sow's 2 cubs poke their heads up to see what the sow was looking at. He was way too close to her to be comfortable and hoped she would catch his scent on the breeze and disappear, but the sow had other plans. Now there had been a real dilemma developing between area farmers and grizzly bears around Grand Prairie. It seemed the hungry bears loved filling themselves up on the delicious oats from the farmers' fields. Fish and game officers had recently flown over the area in a helicopter and noted seeing 7 grizzly bears in the 4 to 5 square kilometers around the field Chris was scouting. Locals reported finding piles of grizzly bear scat loaded with digested oats, affirming that the bears were raiding the fields to augment their diets. As soon as Chris saw the sow stand to her hind legs, he knew he didn't want to confuse her about what he was. He immediately ripped his face mask off, so that she could see he was a human and not a deer or some other delicious animal. The terrified man lifted his arms straight over his head and waved them around frantically as he yelled at her, hoping this display might frighten her away. Right when Chris began to yell, the sow dropped to all fours and began to charge straight toward him. She had apparently seen enough to make a decision on how to handle his close presence to her and her cubs. He was hoping she would veer off or slow down, as he knew there was no way he could outrun her. His only option was to wait and see if she was bluffing, or if her intentions toward him were much more serious. As the grizzly ran toward him, her head was high, and her eyes focused like lasers on Chris. He knew she was not bluffing, and that the outcome of this run-in would be bad. The sow huffed and chuffed her way toward him like some kind of locomotive with teeth. Chris lifted the digital camera he was carrying, hoping the flash would startle her and make her reconsider her options. When the flash didn't go off, he knew the only other weapon he had to defend himself was his hunting knife. Chris lifted his knife above his head and braced for impact. The sow slammed into his gut at full speed, sending him flying backward and his arms flailing to maintain his balance. As his arms reached out, the sow clamped her jaws onto his right forearm, just between his wrist and his elbow. Her momentum drove the bear right through Chris and wrapped him around her neck and shoulders with the impact. Whether it was an act of deliberation or desperation, Chris plunged his hunting knife into the sow just in front of her shoulder at the base of her neck. The blade sank into her flesh clear to the tang and blood sprayed in every direction. Chris recalled feeling a sudden sensation of warmth all over his body as the grizzly's blood drenched him from his head to his toes. The sow then turned her head and bit into his back. Before she could pull away from him, Chris plunged his hunting knife into her flesh 2 more times in quick succession. After the impact, Chris was lying on the ground, waiting for the next painful bite from the sow, when she turned around and walked away. He could see blood pouring from the huge wounds his hunting knife had opened up in her neck, but was more worried about getting to safety than anything else. The wounded man kept his eyes down to avoid instigating a follow-up attack. Chris cupped his clearly mangled right arm to his body as he quickly made his way toward the edge of the field and away from that angry sow. It only took a few minutes before Chris could find a farmer, who immediately dialed 911 to request medical help. First responders from the Grovedale Fire and Rescue rendered first aid as they transported him to the nearest hospital. At the medical center, Chris's arm was x-rayed and found to have both the radius and ulna bones severely broken. One of the nerves that controlled his hand had been damaged as well. Surgery was required to insert metal plates to repair the damage done to his arm bones and start him on the road to recovery. As for the sow, she was found dead only 30 yards from where her dust-up with Chris had occurred. There was no indication of what had happened to her cubs, nor their age. If they were spring cubs, they would stand no chance of survival without her, and only a slightly higher one if they were from the prior spring. Reflecting on the mishap, Chris says that he was lucky, and acknowledged the bear could have inflicted much more damage on him in the first few moments of the attack. Different scenarios still flashed through his mind as being at the wrong place at the wrong time and running into the wrong bear continues to haunt him. An outfitter who lives in the area, Dave Coleman, reported spotting the sow and her cubs only a few days before Chris's attack. He expressed admiration in Chris's ability to stay calm and cool in such a desperate situation. Chris indicates that he will bow hunt again after his arm is repaired and rehabilitated fully. He still deals with just how lucky he was, and how things could have ended up very differently for him. This episode reminds me of Jeremy Evans and Gene Moe's attack, which are both episodes on this channel. All 3 episodes featured victims who were tough beyond measure. Which of these 3 do you think was the most amazing bear attack? Post your answers in the comments section. After reviewing the details of this attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Was Chris just lucky in stabbing the bear in the perfect spot during the attack? Would you consider a hunting knife with a 12-inch blade a good grizzly bear deterrent? How many things can you list that Chris did wrong in the lead-up to the attack? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the agricultural fields surrounding Cody, Wyoming. When you think of grizzly bear attacks, a cornfield isn't the first background that comes to mind. But this area isn't just farm fields. The Shoshone National Forest surrounds it and is only about 30 miles east of Yellowstone National Park. The land between the park and the farmland is remote and rugged mountains with uninterrupted forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees along the ridges. The Shoshone National Forest is on the eastern slope of the Great Divide, and all the waters that fill the creeks head toward the Mississippi River. Down in the valleys, willows and berry bushes screen the creek banks for the animals that live there. Moose, mule deer, elk, and antelope are common sights here. Black bears, bobcats, cougars, grizzly bears, and wolves stalk the trails while they raise the next generation of predators. Although the ridges and hillsides may be as wild as they've ever been, the agricultural areas in the valleys are dotted with ranches and farms. The water that feeds the creeks and streams is often diverted to water the corn, wheat, and alfalfa that grows here. It may be too remote for most people, but the hardy people of western Wyoming wouldn't live anywhere else. This lifestyle demands hard work, which shapes and conditions the people who work the land. On Thursday, June 20th, 2013, 65-year-old Nick Patrick had beaten the sun out of bed and was headed toward his fields. The creek beds around Nick's fields were crowded with brush and smaller trees that hid pheasants, grouse, and deer. They were all common sights in the early morning hours and were always a pleasant surprise for Nick. Nick was a big supporter of the protection of grizzly bears in Wyoming. He served on the Greater Yellowstone Coalition Board, which strives to preserve vital habitats, create travel corridors for wildlife, and connect human allies to support these resources. Nick had even hosted board meetings at his ranch in recent years. This week, Nick had a handful of special visitors to his ranch. His oldest daughter had brought her 4 children to visit Grandpa on the ranch, but Nick didn't let that pull him away from his work. He would complete the day's work, then visit with them afterward, catching up on all the fun events that had transpired in their lives. As Nick worked his way along the ditch bank, his dog began to bark incessantly a short distance away. Raccoons were common in the area, and Nick assumed the dog had run into another one. He picked up his shovel and headed toward the gully, located about 50 yards from where he was working in the field. Just as Nick began to walk down into the gully, he could see his dog. It was barking toward the brush along the creek, but what he was barking at wasn't very clear. Before Nick could gain control of the dog, a huge sow grizzly stormed from the brush, followed closely by her 2 cubs. Grizzly bears are not an uncommon sight around Cody, especially on the hills above Nick's fields. They can be seen grazing their way across green meadows from the roads in springtime. Once in a while, a problem will arise with a bear killing livestock or raiding grain supplies, but generally they keep to themselves. They tend to avoid anything affiliated with humans as much as possible. Once the sow set her eyes on Nick, there wasn't much taking her attention away from him. She quickly covered the ground between them at a rate that didn't afford Nick any time to think, let alone react. He could see her massive shoulder muscles ripple with each stride as she streaked toward him. It was clear by her immense size that Nick could not fight her, and he knew good and well there was no sense in trying to outrun her.
Nick had only one weapon at his side, his trusty shovel. He picked it up like a baseball bat and did his best impression of Babe Ruth upside the grizzly's head. As the shovel smacked against the sow's skull, Nick soon realized the noise it made was the worst part. The grizzly wasn't bothered by the blow from the shovel and didn't slow down in her progress toward him. Given he had put all of his energy into swinging the shovel, Nick was briefly left in a twisted posture. Both of his arms were holding the shovel, which was now to his left and behind him. This pose left his face pointed toward the bear, with nothing to protect it. The angry sow used the awkward position Nick's shovel swing had left him in, and clamped her jaws around his entire face.
Her canines sank in from cheekbone to cheekbone, and when she closed her jaws, she peeled off the skin between them, including Nick's nose. The cracking and popping of his cheekbones drowned out all the other noise Nick could hear. The sow pulled the mouthful of Nick's face away, while pressing his shoulders with her paws. As the sow loosened her grip on Nick's face, she slid her jaws down his body to his left knee. Clamping her jaws onto it, she dragged him about 20 feet, puncturing and tearing flesh as she did so. Now missing most of the middle part of his face and fearing the sow was going to continue her attack, Nick flipped onto his stomach. Playing dead must have seemed like the best option, as resistance was clearly futile. He was hoping that he could cover up any vulnerable parts of himself that she hadn't yet bit into, but for some reason the sow suddenly changed her mind. It may have been thoughts of her cubs, or perhaps she felt Nick was no longer a danger. Either way, the sow disappeared into the brush as Nick lay on his stomach. As he lifted his head from the soil, Nick could feel his upper lip flopping against his chin. He knew this grizzly had done some terrifying damage to his face, so he reached into his pocket in search of his cell phone. He pulled the phone out and quickly dialed 911, hoping to find a calming professional on the other end. Unfortunately for Nick, the gully he was in was without reception, and no one answered his call for help. Upon seeing him moving, the grizzly sow bounded back in Nick's direction. She must have figured he was dead when she left, and was a bit angered to see he wasn't. This time she bit onto the back of his head and chewed up his scalp real good. Like the unwilling participant in some kind of sadistic game, Nick jerked and screamed each time the sow bit into a different area than she had previously. The pressure from her jaws was the most overwhelming sensation. Nick had never felt such pain before in his life, and felt the bear's canines piercing his flesh and slamming against his bones, with crunches that resonated through his body. Her claws and teeth punched quick holes and gashes through Nick's vest and back before she dashed back into the brush. As soon as she left him, Nick peeked up the gully to see her gather her cubs and leave. He continued to watch the bears as they disappeared from sight, hoping that she would not return for a third round. Nick pulled himself together and began assessing his wounds, at least those that he could see. His most devastating injury was clearly out of his view, but he could feel the middle part of his face was missing. It may have been the adrenaline, but Nick knew he had to get to medical help as quickly as possible. There was no one walking along that gully any time soon, in all likelihood, and Nick couldn't afford to wait for help. He slowly worked his way to his feet and staggered toward his home, which was a few hundred yards away. After reaching his home, he stumbled his way back to his shop. Nick knew his grandkids would run outside to see him as soon as he arrived, and he knew that the damage the sow had inflicted on his face would terrify them. He immediately stumbled into his workshop in search of a towel, trailing blood behind him. Wiping the blood and other bodily fluids from his face, Nick eventually found the towel he was looking for and draped it over his head. Then he staggered toward the house to ask them to call for medical help. When first responders arrived, they loaded Nick into the ambulance and rushed him toward West Park Hospital in Cody. As soon as he arrived, the medical staff there recognized that his wounds were far too severe for treatment from their facility. They arranged for a medical helicopter to transport Nick to the University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, Colorado. He was stabilized there and remained in the intensive care unit while a ventilator helped him breathe. The middle of Nick's face, including his nose and all the skin between his cheekbones, had completely been removed. The risk of infection was immediately identified, given the injuries to his sinuses only a few inches from his brain. Wyoming Game and Fish officers began an investigation into the cause and circumstances of Nick's grizzly bear attack. They set out culvert traps along the gullies and fields in the area, hoping to catch the bears before any further incidents could occur. If they caught the sow, they could check her for a lip tattoo or an ear tag to gauge whether she had been a problem bear or if this was simply an isolated incident. They were not considering euthanizing the sow without knowing her background, if there was one at all. The wardens found the sow's tracks and followed them away from the agricultural areas in the valley. The bears had departed for more remote areas away from people. Given she would not likely encounter any more people in the location she had ended up at, they decided to stop tracking her, for now. Wardens decided the grizzly sow had reacted to a perceived threat to herself and her cubs. As severe as it was, the attack was deemed a defensive attack. Nick's dog ended up with a long gash down his back, but recovered from his run-in with the grizzly. Nick's efforts had likely saved his dog's life, but nearly cost him his own. As Nick slowly recovered in the ICU, his friends sent prayers and messages of support. They noted that being in good physical condition probably contributed to him surviving the severe mauling. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Would the sow have left after the initial attack if he had played dead? Did the presence of the dog add an aggravating circumstance for the grizzly? Do you think this sow should be pursued and killed after such a brutal mauling? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.